futures. It's a word that should be on everybody's lips, but so often gets pushed aside. And I understand the reasons why. We're living in an age of the polycrisis, of these multi-layered, complex, uncertain challenges ahead of us. And these challenges are real for our communities and our public services. But I hope that over the course of this talk, I'll be able to encourage you to embrace the F word as part of our daily lives. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act will be marking its 10th anniversary this year, an opportunity for us to feel proud about legislating in this way. It's quite a radical thought for a government to think to the long term, not just to the next election. More about that in a moment, because the future can be something often we push to other people to worry about, somebody else's responsibility to think about. But perhaps if I can encourage you to think about the 10.3 billion people or so that will inherit the planet or beyond the Earth by 2100. Or as Roman Krznaric would put it in The Good Ancestor, some statistics for you, there's around 7.7 billion people alive on Earth today as our friends. That means that around 100 billion have passed here on Earth over the last 50,000 years. But to put it into perspective, we're expecting 6.75 trillion people in the 50,000 years to come. That's the horizon that I'm wanting us to stretch towards over the course of our lives. Our Act is very unique. We're the only country in the world to legislate on the basis of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we put this into action. We put the future at the heart of decision-making, meaning that we're very keen to make sure that the decisions we make today don't compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Now I'm going to start with the past. 1923-24 to be precise, a remarkable moment, the Welsh Women's Peace Petition. A petition of around 390,000 found its way from Wales, in fact, from Aberystwyth, where the National Conference on Women took place, here, not too far from us. And that petition called on the world leaders to take peace seriously in the aftermath of the First World War. Now, remember, women didn't have the same voting rights as men at the time, and that's why this story for me is particularly poignant, because not, I'm afraid, the hundreds and thousands of women on that petition, but actually because of this man, Frederick Arthur Fox. Now, this is my great-great-grandfather, who also found that being a feminist and a futurist mattered in 1924, and joined, therefore, in the signatories of that petition. The petition found its way nearly 101 years ago to the day, on the February 21st, 1924, where the petition was handed to President Coolidge at the White House. A remarkable moment, meaning that Wales mattered on the international stage, Wales's values mattered, and taking that petition all the way to the States. It's a poignant story because I found that in September of last year, a century later, that I too was in the US. In fact, joining the UK government's delegation to the United Nations, where we were encouraging countries to adopt the similar legislation that we had here in Wales of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I was very pleased that member states adopted the Declaration on Future Generations last September. But unknowingly to me that 100 years before that, my great-great-grandfather was sending a similar message. And I share this because within the 390,000, I am pretty certain that you will find connections with your ancestors amongst those signatories. And the great journey now continues in the National Library, not too far from here, where the petition is being digitized. So I would encourage you to find out if you have a relative in that story, or perhaps not in that story, but stories of Wales's contribution on the international stage about doing something about the world that we wanted to achieve in the future. The appeal was quite simple: to aid in the effort to hand down to the generations which come after us the proud heritage of a warless world. A very clear message, very direct message to the US, in particular at the time, who weren't members of the League of Nations. We now know it to be the United Nations. So Wales really championing the importance of international solidarity and coming together on that basis, possibly messaging that we should be continuing to advocate for in 2025. What Wales is doing today, the world will do tomorrow. Those were the words of the United Nations in 2015 at the passing of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And I'm pretty certain that the majority of us today, whilst constrained by our short-termism of understanding the next election, the next quarter, might struggle to see past the next year. I deeply believe that we're all futurists. We all set alarms, we all put plans in our calendars. Many of us have mortgages that stretch far into the future. Many of us, with fingers crossed, believe that Wales will win the next World Rugby Cup. No, let's be more positive than that. And all of us have been asked the question once in our lives, what do we want to be when we grow up? We don't ask those questions anymore in terms of where do we see ourselves in 10, 20, 30 years' time. And it's really important that we ask those questions in policy making, because if we don't, the cost of inaction means that current and future generations will suffer environmental degradation, health and social inequalities widening, culture and the Welsh language depleting, all the things that we care about today and that we want to pass on to those not yet born. And all across the world there are examples, and I'm really proud that Wales is not the first and not the only country in this narrative. I'm hopeful that as a result of the UN Summit of the Future, other countries will follow. But the story in Wales isn't ours alone to tell. It means that we have to look at the indigenous peoples across the world who've been championing the seventh generation principle for far longer than we have, whether it's in Turtle Island or North America, for those who are less familiar with its original name, or down in New Zealand and Australia. The idea of taking action for those not yet born is deeply intergenerational and deeply historic, and we should remember that Wales doesn't own a concept around thinking to the long term, but actually something that's ingrained in our ancestry, in our global community as well. And I'm very excited that only in the recent weeks we've had the Australian Parliament receive the first Future Generations Bill. So it is possible that Australia will be the next country to follow in Wales's footsteps in legislating on this basis. The Cymru Can strategy by the Future Generations Commissioner is more than just words. It's part of a movement in an attempt to meet the aspirations of the people of Wales that set out a national conversation in 2014 called The Wales That We Want. And these 7 interconnected well-being goals matter to all policymakers. I often get asked when I travel internationally, how do you achieve this? And the first thing I say, well, it's the law, they have to. And there's something about legislating for this to happen. Of course, it requires behaviour change. And it's only 10 years in, and I appreciate that we've got a lot to do. But across Wales, from public sector to the voluntary sector, businesses, academia, or the Welsh women of 1923, deeply we're all working towards this agenda, and I'm really hopeful that we can continue to build on the successes, whether that's bold transport strategies, whether it's the national curriculum for Wales of embedding an anti-racist Wales into the practices across the country. And it requires bold leadership, policymakers in the Senedd, in our government, to think and act for the long term, not always popular with current generations. But I would encourage you to walk away today and think about these prompts on the screen in the hope that you can become active futurists. And quickly, the Futures Toolkit that I hope that you can take some inspiration from. And the first one is to apply that futures mindset. Ask the question, how are your actions today taking into account the 10, 25, 50, dare I say, the 100-year horizon ahead of us? The questions you should consider around, how do I travel from A to B? What am I procuring? Who am I procuring from? How could you apply, therefore, that futures mindset in your own daily lives? Have intergenerational conversations, be that with your family, friends, neighbours, intersectionality matters when we talk about the future. Whose future? In fact, futures is possibly the better phrase to use in ensuring that we create a just and equitable future for all, leaving no one behind. And thirdly, to be creative. We are facing current and new challenges, old challenges, and it requires us to think creatively about solving them. So nurture that skill, not just as artists and professions working in the creative industry, but also our public services, and understanding that it's a key skill if we're going to meet the aspirations of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And then, I've alluded to this, but engage with your past. There are so many lessons to be learnt of our ancestry across Wales and globally, particularly in the global south. And then, gwnewch y pethau bychain a byddwch lawen, that second part, not always familiar, but the words of St. David, to do the small things, and to do so joyfully is his second part. That second bit doesn't always get airing. Because the small steps, the incremental steps towards the future that we want matter. Many of you are familiar with the idea of planting a tree, that our future generations will be able to sit in the shadows of it. And I really do believe that those small steps matter in our daily lives and in the big, bold decisions that policymakers will make. So I leave you in the hope that the F word is something that you want to embrace far more in your vocabulary, in your conversations. And Aberystwyth has always been that place of innovation where modernity and history meet, where the local and intergenerational and the international come together, whether it's the Welsh women of 1923 who came here, whether it's Lord David Davis of Llandinam and his work around health and peace, or whether or not it's student activism that ingrained in me the importance of self-purpose and working for others. That, I hope, becomes more of a reality in the years to come for those also seeking to champion and be vehicles for change for the future. So please do go out there today and the rest of your lives championing the F word. Diolch.